Hey everyone, in this video we're going to cover the nervous system. Now, before I begin, I should point out, and I've said this before with other systems, but it is so true in this case, the nervous system is extremely complex, extremely extensive. It incorporates the brain, the spinal column, all the nerves in your body in a very, very sophisticated, complex sort of way. So we can't cover all those details in this class. So what I'm going to do is give you a broad overview of the basic functions and characteristics of the nervous system. There are other classes you could take where you could spend an entire year just studying the brain, and that's not what this class is about. So, to begin, the nervous system is basically broken down into two broad categories. One is the central nervous system, or CNS, and the central nervous system is the brain and spinal column. So basically, just this brain and the spinal column that takes all these axons, all these nerves, nervous cells, and brings them down to other parts of your body through your spinal column. Okay. Then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves and ganglia. I'll talk about all this later, but all the parts of the nervous system that bring the sensation and motor function out to your arms, your legs, your feet, all your organs, etc. So we're going to begin with the central nervous system, and then we'll talk a little about the peripheral nervous system. And if we're going to begin with the central nervous system, we've got to begin with the brain. Now again, I could spend hours just talking about the brain, but we don't have that kind of time. So we're just going to get a broad overview of some of the interesting and important characteristics of the brain. The first thing I'd want to point out, as you can see from this image here, is that the brain has several sections to it, and each section has a different aspect of the human body or human functions that it deals with in particular. So folks often imagine the brain to be kind of one uniform thing, and an injury to the brain means that everything's going to go haywire. That's not the case. By the way, neither is it the case that you use like 5 or 10 or 15% of your brain or whatever other claims there are. There's no part of your brain that isn't filled with nerve cells and functioning fully. The brain has to do all kinds of complex things. It's not just about thinking and planning and reflection, but about controlling your breathing, controlling your digestion, controlling your motor function, etc. We're going to talk about all that, but all parts of the brain are engaged in that process. Does that mean you're living up to 100% of your potential? Probably not. You probably aren't living up to 100% of your potential. Who among us are? But it's not the case that maybe your middle school teacher told you you're only using 5% of your brain. You're using all your brain. Okay, so the brain is broken up into different sections. Some of the important ones, the basic ones that I want to point out here include the frontal lobe, that's that front portion there in red, the parietal lobe, and my wife likes to tell her students that you can remember that name because it's like a party hat. The parietal lobe is right on top. Okay, whatever. The parietal lobe is that blue part. The occipital lobe, which is the green part there in the back. The yellow parts on either side are the temporal lobes, and then in the bottom there is the cerebellum. Now, the reason I want to point out these sections is not so you can memorize them, but rather so you can appreciate that different parts of the brains specialize in different sorts of things. So that frontal lobe is about high mental function. That's where you're doing your planning, your judgment, your analysis, etc. The parietal lobe is principally sensory. So this is where you kind of like appreciate heat or textual differences. So when it's hot, when you're feeling that it's hot or cold out, etc., that may be in part, or if the stove is hot or cold, that may be coming through your parietal lobe. There's other aspects of the parietal lobe too. That's why I'm stuttering a little bit, because I'm trying to simplify it. I don't want to get into too much detail. I should point out that voluntary motor function is sort of right there at the front part of the parietal lobe, or the back part, if you'd like, of the frontal lobe. So there is, just behind the frontal lobe, there's a section there that specializes, and it's called the motor cortex, that specializes in voluntary motor function. The reason I say voluntary motor function is there's some motor functions that you don't think about, that just happen on their own. But when you raise your hand, or when you voluntarily, I don't know, lift your leg, that's all motor function, voluntary motor function, and that happens through the motor cortex. The occipital lobe is actually where your vision is analyzed and put into some kind of perception. So, I mean, your eyes are taking in light, and so that's where vision is happening. But where you make sense of it, where you see something of a certain shape, and you make sense of that as a tree on a landscape, that's happening in the occipital lobe there in the back. So basically those nerves go all the way through your head and all the way into the back of your brain. The temporal lobe on either side, principally short-term memory. And then in the bottom, the cerebellum there in brown, that's where much more basic functions, like basic motor functions, balance, posture. So the kind of motor function that allows you to stand up, that's happening there in the cerebellum. Equilibrium, that sort of stuff, right? Okay. The reason I kind of want you to appreciate that different parts of the brain are responsible for different kinds of actions is because it allows you to make sense of all kinds of crazy and interesting things that happen in public health. This is an image of Phineas P. Gage. In about 1848, I think it was, Phineas P. Gage was involved in an explosion. He was a foreman, I think in a mining facility, or maybe machining, but I think it was mining. And an explosion happened, and that pipe that he's holding there, that big rod, that went right through his eye. That's why he's missing that eye. That went right through his eye and into his brain. And this is like 1848, so basically you're usually toast. Except that, in this case, he was very lucky, to some degree, because it just got a bit of his frontal cortex. And the reason this is interesting is within a couple of days, he regained consciousness and seemed perfectly healthy, could breathe normally, could move normally, could walk and talk, etc., except his personality had changed significantly. He became childlike, he became kind of disinhibited, he became inappropriate at times, kind of an inability to control his anger and other kinds of emotions. He became kind of a wild man. He became, or if you'd like, a jerk, right? And so his personality changed pretty fundamentally, but it only hit his frontal cortex. And of course, that's where those kinds of regulatory functions, like, I don't know, briefly in your head you think, hey, maybe I'd like to do something crazy right now. But then you think, no, probably church is not the right place to do something too crazy, right? Well, he didn't have that stopping action. And so while he was perfectly healthy, his personality had changed fundamentally, which is kind of interesting. What's also interesting, and if you hear this story from other folks, they'll often miss this, is with time, his personality started to go back to his regular personality. In other words, he re-socialized himself and relearned limits and control and appropriate behavior, etc. And so later in his life, actually, he became closer to what he had been before the accident. There's all kinds of other reasons that it's interesting to know that different parts of the brains function differently. We use it, for example, for diagnosis. I'll tell you a story of my own experience fairly recently where I was caring for somebody who had cerebral small vessel disease, which means the small vessels going to his brain, we've talked about this before, were breaking down. And as a result of that, a portion of his brain was no longer getting adequate blood, adequate energy, adequate oxygenation, all these things that we talked about with perfusion, right? So he had been experiencing dementia for a couple of years. And I was with him and I knew his behavior, so I knew the kind of dementia he'd experienced. He had some short-term memory loss. He couldn't remember also people's names, but he had, interestingly, some long-term memory retention, which was interesting because that happens in a different part of your brain. So, for example, he could remember things he did when he was a child, in the 1940s and 50s, but he couldn't remember somebody's name that he'd lived with over the past 20 years. So the reason that I'm pointing this out is it was pretty stable for a couple of years. And then I was caring for him one day, and I noticed, he's having difficulty controlling motor function, what we call ataxia. And in particular, he's definitely having difficulty coordinating his eyesight with his motor function. So when he was eating, he was stabbing with his fork and missing the things he was eating. I made a note of that. Interesting. Then later in the day, we went for a walk, and he was dragging a foot. And I thought, there's more serious motor function that's now diminished. And I knew then that other parts of his brain had been affected. And so I had a serious talk with his family at that point and said, look, we're going to see a pretty steep decline now. It's very likely because we're now seeing other parts of the brain. In other words, other vessels that hadn't yet been affected suddenly now were in play and starting to have some significant dysfunction and disease process. And as a result of that, other parts of the brain were starting to fall apart. And sure enough, 3 weeks later, he was dead, as his brain function just simply cascaded. So doctors, other care providers, can often use these kinds of hints to figure out sort of what's going on. Another example of this might be a TIA, which stands for transient ischemic attack, also called a mini stroke. This is when a portion of the vessels going to your brain don't fall apart, but rather get clogged. A thrombus. Remember, we talked about a thrombus. A thrombus somewhere in your body kicks off a little embolus. We talked about that too. And that emboli floats and happens to lodge in a vessel going to your brain. And now you've got an embolism. And that embolism cuts off function in a portion of your brain. In the case of a TIA, the first word is transient, temporarily. And so you have sort of this stroke-like effect, usually focused in just one aspect, just the aspect affected by that part of the brain, for a short period before that embolism clears. So a TIA could manifest as weakness or numbness on one side of the body, maybe just tingling and difficulty using one arm, maybe just vision problems, maybe just loss of balance, maybe just weakness or dizziness. So you might be caring for somebody, maybe somebody who's older someday, or you know somebody who has a TIA. And you don't have to be terribly old. This isn't 80 and above. Somebody could certainly have a TIA even in their 40s and their 50s. And they might say something like, boy, weirdest thing, I was sitting on the couch watching TV and I just couldn't use my arm. For like an hour, my arm got tingly and I really couldn't move it. Get to the hospital right away, because the portion of the brain that's responsible for managing and allowing the use of that arm was temporarily disabled. And now the arm movements come back, but that person needs care to make sure that doesn't happen again, because frequently after these mini strokes, this is a warning sign that a more significant stroke is coming in the future. So you see, it's kind of interesting to realize that different parts of the brains have different kinds of specialties. Here is a cross-section of a brain that's sort of interesting because it shows you the brain stem. Now the point here that I want to make is interesting is that the brain stem is that lower part of the brain, and then as we go up and forward, we get to the cognitive parts of the brain that we talked about that are responsible for planning and things like that. And in the brain stem are parts like the medulla oblongata, which just means the long middle. And these kinds of parts, the midbrain, the pons that I think we talked about before when we talked about respiration, these control basic functions like respiration. So controlling your breathing, responding to a lack of oxygen or an excess of carbon dioxide, managing heart rate, managing blood pressure. These kinds of things happen in those lower parts of the brain. And then as you go up in the brain, more sophisticated things happen. And this is in part because when you are developing as an embryo, that's the way the development takes place. In other words, the basic functions that are required for human life happen first, and then you build the parts of the brain that allow for more sophisticated functions. And it also works out in a beneficial way in evolutionary terms, because what it means is that the core parts of the brain that you need just to survive, like just to control breathing or just to control heart rate, are deep in the brain and less likely to be injured or damaged with any kind of trauma. So if you whack your head, you may lose some memory, you may have wacky eyesight for a little while, but you probably won't lose the ability to breathe. Or at least you're less likely to lose that ability, right? The other part that you'll notice from this brain image is that there's this opening there in the middle, and that is called a ventricle. Remember when we talked about hearts, we talked about ventricles too. Ventricle in Latin just means a small belly. So any kind of opening like that can be called a ventricle. And in this case, there are several ventricles in the brain that are kind of openings in the brain, because what you have to realize is the whole brain is kind of floating. It's floating in a fluid, and that fluid is basically like your blood without the red blood cells and a few other components to it, right? So we call that cerebral spinal fluid. and that means it's the fluid that surrounds your cerebrum, your brain, and your spinal column. So that whole central nervous system has this fluid around it. It is connected with your overall circulation. In other words, the fluid from your blood goes through a blood-brain barrier and surrounds the brain and fills all those ventricles. And interestingly, in the middle there, I don't know if you can kind of see it, but in the middle of those two openings on either side, it's really kind of one opening, but in the middle of that one opening is the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is actually the part of the brain that connects the two, the right and left side of the brain. So the two parts can kind of coordinate together. And I know you've heard ideas that people are right brain thinkers or left brain thinkers, etc. And there's a little bit of truth to that, but not much truth to that. Don't put a whole lot of stock into that. There is some testing of physiological indications that types of thinking happen on your right and left side, but you just saw me lay out the brain and actually how it is really compartmentalized and the special sections. That's the stuff you really want to understand. The right and left brain stuff is largely exaggerated. Okay, when I talked about that fluid then, I want to bring this up as a mechanism that protects the brain. You see, the brain is super important because without it, you're not going to live very long, right? And would you want to live very long, right? So there's a lot of different ways that the body has evolved to protect the brain. One is to put it in a cerebrospinal fluid. So your brain is floating in this fluid. Another is to surround your brain by a protective set of tissue called meninges. And these meninges around the brain and the central nervous system have three layers to them. On the outside, there's like a tough layer of tissue. Really a hard and durable protective tissue. So that would be right up against the skull. And that's called the dura mater, which in Latin means tough mother. So the tough mother, or dura mater, is out there as a really tough surface that surrounds the brain and holds that fluid in place just on the inside of your skull. Then, inside of that is the arachnid layer, and if that sounds and reminds you of a spider, that's because that's what it looks like. That's a thin, sort of wispy layer that looks a lot like a spider web, so it has that name. And then on the inside of that, along your brain, so now against your brain, is the pia mater, and pia means tender. So in this case, it's tender mother. And that is a soft, gentle, supportive tissue that surrounds and protects the brain. And all of that is in your skull, or what we call the cranial vault. And we use the term cranial vault to point out that it's an entirely closed system. So your brain is nestled there in this really hard outside bone that protects it on all sides. That's a good thing in terms of protection. It's a tricky thing in terms of coordinating, or I should say controlling, cerebral spinal fluid, because if you get too much spinal fluid, you'll get pressure and there's nowhere for that pressure to go. So one way that we sometimes get injuries to brains is that you get a buildup of cerebral spinal fluid because of some injury or disease process, and that puts pressure on the brain. And the brain is very sensitive to its environmental conditions, like having physical pressure on it. So because there's no place for the pressure to go because your brain is protected in this cranial vault, a lot of cerebral spinal fluid, or a buildup of cerebral spinal fluid, can be problematic to the brain and cause immediate symptoms like difficulty concentrating, cognitive loss, and death if it's allowed to continue. The entire, by the way, central nervous system is protected in this way. So that meningeal layer, that goes all the way down around your spinal column. So it protects the major part of the brain, the medulla oblongata, and the lower parts of the brain stem, and all the way down the spinal column. The spinal column itself, I'll talk about in a bit, but I want to point out first that there's another way the brain is protected. Very quickly, let me remind you that one way the brain is protected is to ensure adequate blood flow, and that happens from the circle of Willis. And we talked about that before. I showed you an image of it. Here's an image again of that circle of Willis. This is underneath the brain, and what you see there is that the arteries that are delivering blood to the brain are all connected together in this circle. So if there's a compromise in the flow of any one of those arteries, the other arteries can still provide adequate blood flow to that circle of Willis. So this is a way that the brain ensures that it gets adequate blood flow. It also creates some vulnerabilities, as we talked about before, because last time you saw this, we were talking about aneurysms and how all those joints and junctions means that when you do have a cerebral aneurysm, it's usually at the circle of Willis. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about, and we mentioned this briefly too when we talked about circulation, is that blood-brain barrier. This is another way the brain is protected, in that instead of just allowing everything that's in your blood to go into your brain, there is a filtering mechanism that stops blood from going to your brain, and instead it selectively, actively transports only the things that are necessary to the brain through to the brain. In other words, from your blood circulation, blood doesn't go directly to your brain, but instead there are cells that actively take things like oxygen, glucose, amino acids that your brain needs and bring those to your brain. Other things like red blood cells, white blood cells, those protective cells, those don't actually go to your brain, which, by the way, is good in this way that by having that blood-brain barrier, it means your brain is protected from any kind of toxin or any kind of potential bacteria, virus, something like that. So that's good to protect the brain. But on the bad side, what it means is that if you're trying to take medicine, for example, to get rid of an infection that is around your brain, that medicine can't get through because it has to get through that active transport mechanism, and that won't happen. And in addition to that, white blood cells can't get through. So the normal defensive mechanisms that would protect you from an infection also can't get through. But in some ways, this is good and bad, right? Because we know that those white blood cells are involved in the inflammatory mechanism that creates tissue reconstruction and scarring, and that could actually have some significant injury to parts of the brain, right? So in fact, protecting the brain from infection can't happen in the way it happens in the rest of the body, because the brain is far too sensitive, and any part of the brain's injury would mean that you're going to have a pretty significant dysfunction in some organ or some capacity of your body. So we can't basically protect the brain in the way we protect other parts of your body with white blood cells. And it doesn't matter because the white blood cells can't get through, an evolutionary form of protection. Now that central nervous system then goes down, as we talked about, to the spinal column. Here's an image of that spinal column. That goes down basically to about L2. That shouldn't make sense to you, but that's the second lumbar. So basically we break up your spine into a cervix and then a thoracic portion and then a lumbar portion, which is kind of your lower back. So basically the spinal column goes down to maybe an inch and a half under where your chest would be if you could feel it in your back, right? And the reason for that is that the spinal column stops growing when you're just a few years old, and the rest of your body obviously continues to grow. From there then, while the spinal column itself stops, what happens is the nerve endings continue on. So we call that the coda equina. Do you need to know that? No, but I think it's cool because coda equina means horse's tail. And so you can imagine why. The spinal column ends. The spinal column is one solid thing that brings all kinds of nerve cells down to do things like move your arms and your legs, control your heart, control your gastrointestinal system, etc., etc. And then it ends about here. And at that point, all the remaining nerves that need to go out to your legs and lower body just go out as nerve strands. In other words, you've got this large bunch of strands that looks like a horse's tail. So they called it a coda equina. Okay, so that central nervous system, as you can see there, basically is also involved, or not basically, is actually still part of the, connected with the brain in terms of having that meningeal layer around it, the dura mater, the pia mater on the inside, and surrounded by fluid. Okay, if that all makes sense, then our next stop will be to talk about the actual tissue, the actual cells that make up the nervous system. So we could go into a lot of detail about what the cells of the nervous system look like, but I want to make it simple So what you need to understand is there's basically two types of cells. There are glial cells. And glial cells, best way to describe it is this. Glial in Greek means glue. They are the cells that hold everything together. There's several different types of glial cells. Do you need to know those? No, but at some point, if you want to be a doctor or a nurse or something like that, you will have to memorize all the different types of glue cells in your nervous system. But for our purposes here, just know that there are glial cells, and the glial cells are the cells that kind of make up everything that's actually not a neuron. Neuron are the other sorts of cells. And here's an image of a neuron. Neurons are single cells, but they're interesting and unique sorts of cells. You can see here that top part there that's in purple. That's the main cell body, sometimes called the soma. And in there are the things you'd expect in a cell, like the nucleus and all that sort of stuff. And then you'll notice that outside of that cell body, that major cell body, are these branches that stick out. And there are branches that come from the branches, and those branches go into other branches, etc. Those are called dendrites. Now, what's happening here is that's the part of the nerve that's going to receive input from some other neuron. So in other words, the principal purpose of the neuron is to transmit information. That you should remember, because we talked about that when we talked about the endocrine system, right? This is basically another way to transmit information, is the nervous system. And this is information that's transmitted very quickly, nearly immediately. How is that done? Well, it's done through a very small charge potential, or if you'd like, a very little bit of electrical charge traveling through the cell. So these dendrites pick up that signal, sometimes as a chemical signal, always as a chemical signal of some sort. That then goes into the cell body, and then that signal is sent down that long skinny part that there is in yellow, or surrounded in yellow, I should say. That's the axon. So the axon could be pretty short, could be a few inches. In the human body, the longest one you're going to find is about 3 feet, a little over 3 feet. In some other mammals, it might get longer than that. It kind of depends on what they're going to do, and you can appreciate that because some signals have to only go a short distance. Other signals are going to go a longer distance, right? So what we've got here is just a mode of transmission. The dendrites get a chemical signal. That then travels through the cell as an electrical potential change, a little bit of electricity. That travels down the axon, which could be a few inches to a few feet, until it gets down to the bottom. And when it gets to the bottom, the axon terminals, you'll notice there it connects with other neurons. And so the signal continues. So those lower two purple parts, those are other neurons that connect in this long chain. So in this case, if we were looking at this one, a chemical signal, I don't know, maybe from your brain, maybe from some other part of your body, would send a signal. It would go into the soma, or the cell body. That would translate into an electric charge that would go down the axon, and then it would go to the terminal of the axon, those long skinny parts there, and that would be picked up by a dendrite of another neuron and continue on its way until it reaches the point where it's going to stimulate a motor activity or send a signal to your brain or whatever else it's going to do. One point I want to make is that that axon has around it a protective layer. It's a lipid layer that is meant there. It's called the myelin sheath. And that myelin sheath is meant to, or it functions, I should say, to allow better conductivity of the axon. In other words, allow the electricity to travel through the axon more efficiently, and also to protect the axon to some degree. Here's an image of that myelin sheath. So you see that middle part there? That is the axon. And then you see around it, that darker part, that's the myelin sheath. Now, at this point, if I asked you, what's a myelin sheath made of? You might remember that I mentioned lipids. But you might also remember glial cells, because glial cells are the only other type of cell in the nervous system. So anything that is not a neuron is a form of a glial cell. Is that the only type of glial cells, the one that make up the myelin sheath? No, there's other types as well. But that is an example of a glial cell. And the cells that kind of hold your brain together take all the millions of neurons in your brain and hold them all together. Those are glial cells too. And the glial cells that hold this all together, it goes down your spinal column, those are glial cells too, but different sorts of glial cells, right? Okay, let's apply this back to that discussion we had of the brain. Here's an image of a brain, and this is a human brain that's been cut into. And the reason I want to point this out is because I finally want to explain to you something you might have even used as a term, which is gray matter and white matter. What does that mean? Well, to some degree it's a little misleading. Here's an actual brain, and what you can see there is there's no gray. There's white matter, and the white matter is principally composed of axons. So these are the long, skinny parts of the neuron, and remember, they are surrounded in a myelin sheath. Now, what did I say the myelin sheath is made of? Basically, it's made of lipids. It's made of a form of fat. What's the color of fat? White. So notice that it's white matter. So the parts of the brain, which is the inside part of the brain there, if you cut out the outside part, is principally just those axons that are bringing signals down to other parts of your body. And because they're lipids, because they're fats, that area tends to be very white. Then the outside area that you can see that is pink because it's got a little bit of blood in it. It may not always be pink, but it's going to be a kind of a darker color. But if blood's present, it's going to be pink. That is what we call the gray matter. Why do we call it gray matter? Well, it might have some kind of off-white color, but really it's called gray matter because when it's preserved for dissection, it turns gray. So in fact, it's called gray matter because sort of artificially we pickle the brains before future doctors and nurses get to dissect them, and so they're used to seeing them as somewhat gray. Okay, that gray matter is principally the cell bodies. So you see, this is kind of interesting because the brain is made of cell bodies on the outside with all those dendrites sending signals and coordinating all kinds of electron signaling charges. And then the white matter on the inside is the part that is delivering all those signals to other neurons for a full system of processing. Basically, like an extremely complex organic computer. Okay. The other thing we might want to talk about is a little bit of terminology. So we sometimes talk about, for example, the somatic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system means those nervous system functions that are voluntary or motor functions that are reflexive, so not necessarily voluntary, but they happen automatically as a motor or mechanical function. So in other words, when the doctor snaps on your knee and your knee pops up, that would also be part of the somatic nervous system. But me moving my hand like this, me moving my head side to side, that's all somatic nervous system. And then the autonomic nervous system, the term autonomic sounds like and does imply automatic. This is the nervous system that deals with things that you don't think about. The regulation of your blood pressure, the management of your gastrointestinal system, all those kinds of things happen automatically. That's part of the autonomic nervous system. You might at some point also hear it called the visceral nervous system. Visceral generally in medicine means deeper, so the deeper nervous system, I suppose. Other terms you might have heard of. Now, am I expecting you to memorize these? Be familiar with them a little bit, be able to recognize them, but no. I mean, in your everyday life, you probably don't need to recognize or to memorize all of these, but I want you to at least have heard of them, right? Okay, so what is, for example, a nucleus that you might have heard of that term? That is basically the neuron cell bodies in your central nervous system. And if those neuron cell bodies are in your peripheral nervous system, we call them ganglions. So you might have heard of the term ganglions before. That is just a bunch of neuron cell bodies collected together. And in your brain, they're called a nucleus, or sometimes called a cortex. So you might have heard of the term cerebral cortex. That means it's a lot of these neuron cell bodies all collected together at that point. Then you might have heard of well, we talked about spinal column. So that is just basically a bundle of axons. So all the long skinny parts of the neurons, all bundled together, we can call those a column, as in spinal column. And in the upper central nervous system, it's sometimes called a tract. And in your rest of your body, those are called nerves. That's what a nerve is. So when you, bump your elbow and you say, oh, I hit a nerve, what you're claiming is that you actually smacked the axon of a neuron, or actually a bundle, if you'd like, of axons. The axons don't really travel on their own in every which way. They don't travel like blood, but rather they travel kind of in bundled collection, usually along circulatory path lines. So where you see an artery, you're likely to see a lymphatic vessel, and you're also likely to see a nerve. So they tend to travel together. Okay. What does that look like? For example, when they travel through your spinal column, what does that look like? Well, here's an image of your spinal column. And basically what you can see there is you've got bone all the way around. Then in the middle, you've got that pathway down the center for your spinal column, which is just basically a collection, a tract of axons. Longer axons because they're going from your brain to different parts of your body. And they come out at every step along your body to manage different things. In other words, some are going to come out right about here, and they're going to manage things that are happening in your chest. Some are going to come out a little lower, and they're going to manage things that are happening in your gastrointestinal system. In addition to that, they're going to innervate, and they're going to sense things that are happening at that level. So at each level in your spinal column, or I should say at each level of your spine, you're going to have nerves that are going to come out of the front and the back. The ones that come out of the front, which in medicine, just so you've heard it, we call the ventral side. Ventral means belly in ancient Greece, so the front or belly side. The ventral side, those are motor nerves. So the motor nerves come out the front, and they activate your arms and legs and your autonomic motor function as well. And then ones that come out the back, those are sensory nerves. And those are taking sensory inputs and bringing them back up to the brain. So those are the ones that are connected going down your arm and allow you to feel heat or feel texture or whatever else, and send that signal all the way back to your brain, going through the back of your spine into your spinal column. So at each level of your spinal column, those nerves are coming out. You can appreciate already that this makes you a little more intelligent about something like a spinal column injury. Because if somebody now said, oh, this poor person had a major spinal column injury, your first question would probably be, where? At what level? Because if it's lower down, let's say where I told you before, L1 or L2, the lumbar region 1 or 2, then it probably just affected this person's walking. If it's higher up, it might affect their breathing, or it might affect their arm movement. If it's very high up, it might affect all of the above. So if somebody's got an injury to their spinal column in the cervix, right up here, just under the brain, that could potentially affect all of the body. That's when somebody has an injury that leaves them paralyzed for life. Or if they got some kind of constriction because the bones are misaligned. That could cause some numbness, dysfunction, other sorts of things, in any part of the body beneath that. Or maybe just in the nerves that come out at that level. So you can see that if you're a physician, you're very interested in what level these kinds of injuries happen. And I've already implied this, but I haven't said it. There are two characteristics of these nerves. Some of them are motor nerves. Those ones are coming from the brain to the parts of your body and sending signals, telling my thumb to do this, and all kinds of other things. Some of them autonomic, some of them voluntary. And then there are sensory nerves. And the sensory nerves take sensory signals, heat, texture, touch, etc., and send those back to the brain. And then just to complicate things a little bit, there's some that do both. Okay, So here's an image of that spinal column. That's kind of useful because it shows that front and back part. It reminds us that there's meninges there and that those meninges have a dura mater on the outside, a tough outer layer, tough mother, an arachnoid mater inside that, which looks like a spider web. I'm not going to go into the details about that. And a pia mater inside that is right up against the most sensitive tissue, and that stands for gentle mother or soft mother. Okay. So another thing that comes to mind here is you've probably heard of lumbar or punctures before. I'd say lumbar punctures before. And you might have asked yourself, or maybe you didn't, why do we do lumbar punctures? Why do we do punctures so low? Now it makes sense. We do them below the spinal column because we don't want to accidentally go right through that protective layer. We're going to do them after the spinal column ends when we don't have the risk of causing injury to that spinal column, right? So we're going to do them where the horse's tail is, the coda equina, right? Okay. I guess the other thing I want to talk about, here's an interesting image that shows that side pathway, and you can see there also that that pathway is going to indicate different kinds of functions there. So in the C column, which is those first 5 vertebrae there, you've got certain functions which are upper kind of functions, and then the thoracic area, the T part of your column, you got other functions. This is just as I told you about before, and then way down there at the bottom, you don't really have any spinal column at all because it all ends at about L2-ish. But I guess the point that I want to talk about a little bit, which is really interesting to me, is dermatomes. Because these nerves come out at each of these levels, right? For a moment, think of how they developed. They developed when you were an embryo in early development. You built, as one of the first things you built, your central nervous system. Okay, so you looked like this image here. There's an embryo that I think is about what? About 8 weeks old, something like that. Very tiny, little floppy arms, big head, and you can kind of see there as well developing a central nervous system. You can look through it and see the actual spinal column and see the portion of the brain that's being developed. And what's happening also is that nerves are coming out, those axials are coming out, aligned with each part of the body. So some are coming out high and they're going horizontally, and some come out mid-height and go out horizontally. The interesting thing about this is that as you grow, both in your utero and the rest of your life, you're going to contort and stretch those lines. So initially, when the nervous system was built in utero, it was this elegant thing with a straight line of spinal column coming down, and then signals, nerves coming out horizontally from there and servicing those parts of the body. So in other words, bringing sensory function, innervating nerve function to those parts of the body in a straight line. But then that fetus grows, and as a human, after birth, it grows even more, and it stretches and moves. So your arms are no longer little flaps, they grow into full arms, and the dermatomes stretch out. So here is an image of what those dermatomes look like on a person. And this is kind of interesting, and it's going to be important later when we talk about some of the dysfunction of the central nervous system. But you can see there that, for example, the dermatome that comes out here at about the chest just goes horizontally. That makes sense because that's basically what your chest looked like when you were a fetus. But the ones that come out a little higher up go across the chest and then all the way down the arm and kind of twist a little bit. And the ones that go on your back also twist down your arm. And the ones that go lower really twist and elongate. Why? Well, because you barely had legs when you built this system, and they had to stretch out to innervate the full function of your legs. So you can see like the dermatome there in pink and green on this body image stretch way down the legs, creating innervation, creating nerve endings and sensation and motor function all the way down the leg. Those are dermatomes. The other point I want to make, which you may have already asked yourself, is, okay, I get how these neurons transmit a signal, but a reasonable question, Hasse, is how do they get the signal to like a muscle? Like, I get that they're sending an electric signal, but then what do? They like zap the muscle? No, not quite. What they do is they rely on chemicals at the end of this chain of neurons that will transmit the signal in a useful form to the receiving tissue. And we're pretty familiar now with receiving tissue and how it can kind of receive chemical signals. We've seen that in the endocrine system. We've seen that in all kinds of systems that these chemicals can kind of create interactions, right? These are called neurotransmitters. And there's different types of them. You don't need to know about them, but you've heard of some of them. Serotonin, acetylcholine, dopamine, adrenaline, glutamate. You've heard of these. You've certainly heard of adrenaline and dopamine. You might have heard of serotonin too, because there's a drug out there to fight depression called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI. All of these basically just take the nerve signal and change it into a chemical signal that gets transmitted to the receptor, the muscle or other tissue, the organ that's going to do whatever thing the nervous system is telling it to do. The heart might speed up, the muscle might contract, your arm might therefore go up. You get the idea. Just to kind of show you how this is interesting and important, those serotonin reuptake inhibitors, what are those for? Well, they actually are used to fight depression. They're an antidepressant. And what they do is in the title. They selectively inhibit, slow down or stop, the uptake of serotonin, allowing more serotonin, a neurotransmitter, to remain in place, and therefore allowing the receptors to remain active. And what do those receptors do? They work against depression. So if you're feeling depressed in a dysfunctional way too frequently, if you basically have a clinical diagnosis of depression, this drug could help by allowing more of the serotonin to stay in place longer in your whole central nervous system, in your body, I should say, and therefore allow a mitigation of some of the physiological effects of depression. I should mention briefly, here's an image of it. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but again, as promised, if you're going to be a doctor, you have to memorize all these. There's certain cranial nerves that don't go through the normal spinal column. So in other words, there's 12 nerves in the brain, from the brain that just go directly to different parts of your body. And this kind of makes sense because these are nerves that, for example, allow you to chew or move your mouth, control your tongue, move your eyes. These kinds of things don't need to go through your spinal column and then go back up to your eyes. So those nerves go directly from the brain to that particular part, mostly of your head or your shoulders. The vagus nerve is, I guess, also one of those. So the vagus nerve is a nerve that causes some systematic relaxation, and that's the only cranial nerve I can think of that basically goes anywhere other than the shoulders up. But there are 12 of those, and at some point in your life, if you're going to get into healthcare, you're going to have to memorize them. But if you're just looking to get through this class, no. That's not something we're going to worry about. Just wanted you to have heard of it before. Very briefly, before we end with the nervous system, I want to point out reflexes. And the reason I want to do is because it's kind of interesting exception to what I've described. So far, I've described is motor function starts in your brain, goes to the motor, causes the response. And sensory function starts at the sensors and then goes back to the brain, causes the reception of the signal, except for certain reflexes. So when the doctor, for example, hits your knee and your leg bounces up, that never goes to your brain. That sensory signal happens at your knee, goes to your spinal column, there gets transmitted to a motor function neuron and goes back and creates an almost instantaneous reaction. Now you can see why the doctor might want to check this to see if your nervous system is functioning properly. In other words, does that signal make the loop it's supposed to make? Those reflexes also include, for example, when you touch something hot. When you touch something hot, you've probably noticed, you pull back instantaneously, like within a fraction of a millisecond. You didn't think about it. You don't grab a pan and think, wow, this is really hot. It's burning my hand. I should release this. I'm going to release this now, and then you release your hand. That'd be ridiculous. In fact, you don't even recognize that it's hot until you've already released the pan and pulled your hand away. And that's because that signal never went to your brain. It picked up by your sensory axon, traveled to your central nervous system, but just barely, got transferred to a motor neuron that immediately pulled back your arm extremely quickly. It's an involuntary response to a stimulus, put more technically, but the part that I think you should appreciate is it never really fully goes to your brain. We call that a reflexive arc. So before we leave this topic, I want to briefly mention another aspect of the reflexive arc, because this isn't just about doctors hitting your knee and then your leg popping up or grabbing hold of a hot stove. It also allows for just basic function of your body in an everyday way. We have sensors, as an example of this, called muscle stretch reflexes, MSR, or sometimes called myotactic reflexes. Myo means muscle and tactic means sensor, right? So these are sensors in your muscle that sense stretching or a little bit of tension. And they allow me, for example, to do this, to lean in and lean back out. Because when I lean in, the muscles on the back of my legs sense the stretch and automatically cause adjustment in the rest of my muscles of my legs to maintain balance. But more interesting than that is when I'm not actually thinking about it, when I'm just standing here and not thinking about leaning in or leaning out, my muscles are constantly adjusting their tone, adjusting their degree of contraction or tenseness to allow me to stand here with some balance. So they are constantly using these myotactic sensors, these stretch receptors, to sense when I'm slightly moving forward or slightly moving backwards and adjusting the tone, adjusting the state of contraction in my muscles to allow me to stand up or to allow me to use my muscles in other kinds of coordinated and elegant ways. Like, for example, holding a cup of coffee. You don't want to hold a cup of coffee plus or minus 2 or 3 inches. You want to hold it pretty steady. And you want to hold it pretty steady as you walk through a room. Or if you've ever been a waiter or a bartender or something like that, you want to hold a tray and you want to be able to walk with it through a room. What allows that to happen? You have muscles in your arms, or I should say sensors in your arm muscles that sense this change in tension and automatically adjust so that when you're walking through the room with a coffee cup, you do not have to consciously think about, I need to move the coffee cup 2 degrees to the right, now 1 degree to the left, now half an inch up and 2 degrees back to the right. No, your body is doing that for you with reflexes that are automatically making these connections between your sensors and your muscles. Okay, that's it for the nervous system, a basic, simple introduction to some of the aspects of the nervous system. We're going to get together with the next video and talk about some things that can go wrong with the central nervous system. I'll see you then.